Hello there, faithful listeners. It is Jen here with P40ministries.com. And we have a brand new episode for you today out of Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. I hope everybody's Friday is going splendidly. I am super excited for the weekend. I'm sure you guys are as well. But don't forget that tomorrow my blog updates and I will have a brand new blog post for you tomorrow morning. That will be at 6:30 a.m. Make sure to log on to my website, www.p40ministries.com, and take a look at the newest blog posts that I have for you guys. Every single Saturday, my blog updates at 6:30 a.m. But let's go ahead and begin reading right now. So I'm going to read out of I'm in the Amplified right now, but I think I will switch over to the WEB version today. But as usual, you can read out of whatever version you like. But let's start reading Genesis chapter 18 and start on verse 1 and finish on verse 15. Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat in the tent door of the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and he saw that 3 men stood near him. When he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and he bowed himself to the earth, and he said, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please don't go away from your servant. Now let a little water be fetched, wash your feet, and rest yourself under the tree. I will get a piece of bread so you can refresh your heart. After that you may go your way, now that you have come to your servant." They said, "Very well, do as you have said." Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah, and he said, "Quickly prepare these seahs of fine meal, knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and fetched a tender and good calf, and he gave it to the servant. He hurried to dress it. He took butter, milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and he set it before them. He stood by them under the tree, and they ate. They asked him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" He said, "There in the tent." He said, "I will certainly return to you about this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife will have a son." Sarah heard in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were very old, well advanced in age. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Sarah laughed within herself, saying, "After I have grown old, will I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" Yahweh said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Will I really bear a child when I am old?' Is anything too hard for Yahweh? At the set time I will return to you when the season comes around, and Sarah will have a son." Then Sarah denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." So one thing I find super interesting about this, and I'll touch base on it a little bit more, was the fact that we had already learned that Abraham and God had talked previously, and God had said that Sarah was going to have a son. But Sarah seems super confused and amused at this statement that Jesus says here. And the reason I believe that this is who we know of as Jesus, or the Son of God, is because Jesus is often portrayed as an angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. So in verse 1, it says, Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat in the tent door of the heat of the day. So Abram was sitting in his tent door because it was very hot. So this was probably around noon when the sun is the hottest. And Abraham is sitting there, and it's very hot, and he looks up and he sees these 3 men, and he recognizes them as one of them as Yahweh, and the other 2 were angels, as we will find out later. So he looks up and he sees these 3 men, and he runs to them because he knows that that is Yahweh. And he says to them, he bows low to the earth, and he says, "Lord, if I have found favor in your sight," and that is an old-fashioned way to say, please don't be angry with my sinfulness. So he's saying, "Lord, I am sorry, and if I have found favor in your sight, please don't go away from your servant." So he's saying, stay a little bit. Let me get you some water to wash your feet, because it's dusty and hot, and let me prepare some bread for you and some food so that you can be refreshed. He says, I will get some bread for you so that you can refresh your heart. After that, you can go away, but stay with me a little bit. Stay with me a little bit longer. And they said, okay, yeah, we'll stay. And by the way, I want to mention that I keep saying the word Mamre, the Oaks of Mamre, and I've said it like that quite a while. I don't know if that's how to pronounce it. It might be Mamre. So I might be pronouncing it completely wrong, just to throw that out there. So anyway, they sit down under the oaks of Mamre, the three men, and Abraham hurries into the tent to Sarah, and he basically says to her, hurry and prepare this bread, and knead it and make cakes. And then Abraham runs to his herd, because you know that he's a herdsman. He has lots of calves and sheep and animals, and he finds the best little calf. And he kills it, and it says he dresses it, and he goes and cooks it. And then he ends up giving this big meal to these three travelers, where before he had only told them, I'm going to prepare for you just some bread. But he ended up preparing them this huge meal, because Abraham always did his best. In every single thing that we see of Abraham, he's always doing his best to please the Lord. So he prepares this huge meal, and I don't know how long this would have been. It's very possible that this might have taken a couple hours, and these men were sitting there waiting for this food. Perhaps it took less time than that. But he brings it to them, and he stands under the tree, and he watches them eat. So they're eating, and then they ask him, where is Sarah? Where's Sarah, your wife? And he says, oh, over there in the tent. So I find it funny because Abraham didn't invite her out. And I've actually heard some teachers say that Sarah didn't come out because she felt like she wasn't worth anything, like she shouldn't have came out, and I don't know. I've heard other teachers say that. I've heard other teachers say that Sarah was sinning because she didn't come out. She chose not to come out. But to me, I think this sounds like Abraham didn't invite her. Culturally, back then, women were not considered men's equals. So a woman coming out and talking with a bunch of men probably wouldn't have been considered okay. So Sarah would have stayed behind in the tent unless she was invited out. But she wasn't invited out. And these three men who believe in equality of women because they are God and two angels, and they know that both men and women are created in God's image, they say to Abraham, where's Sarah? Why isn't she out here with us? And he's like, oh, she's over there in the tent. And then it says he said in verse 10, so this is Jesus talking, or the Son of God. He says, I will certainly return to you about this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife will have a son. And he said it loud enough for Sarah to hear in the tent. And Sarah was sitting there snooping in the tent door. She's listening in and eavesdropping. And the tent was behind them. Abraham and Sarah were super old at this point. Sarah was past her childbearing years, even if she was able to have a child, which she wasn't because she was a barren woman. She hears this and she's like, I'm old. And she laughs to herself. She's like, I am old. How could this possibly happen? This is ridiculous. And she says, after I have grown old, will I have pleasure? So she does have a desire for a child. It's very clear here. Will I have pleasure? And my Lord being old also. So she calls Abraham her Lord with a little L. Now, I wouldn't call this a term of endearment, but it was a way to show that she was being submissive to her husband. And she would call her husband my Lord with a little L. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think in maybe next week we'll probably end up talking a little bit more about Sarah's submissiveness to her husband. But after this, she says, my Lord is also old, meaning her husband. My husband is also old. How could I possibly have a son? But then after this, Yahweh says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? So, God knows all. And he hears Sarah laughing behind him. And he says, why did Sarah laugh to herself, saying, will I really bear a child when I am old? And he says, is anything too hard for Yahweh? At the same time, I will return to you when the season comes around and Sarah will have a son. So then Sarah comes outside and she's like, I didn't laugh, because she was scared, because God had just called her out. Who wouldn't be afraid? And he says, no, you laughed. And I find that so funny that he's like, nah, you laughed. You did something wrong. You laughed. Just admit it. And that's kind of where the story ends right here. But you remember that Abraham also laughed. Abraham laughed in his heart as well. And Isaac, who they're supposed to name their son, because God had said, name your son Isaac when you have that son. He says, name your son Isaac, and Isaac means he laughed. And I find that so funny. So I also find it interesting that Isaac means he laughed and not she laughed. Though they both laughed, it's a constant reminder to Abraham that you also laughed. Like, you laughed, your wife laughed, but is anything too hard for God? Of course not, because he created the entire earth. Certainly, he can create life within the womb of an old woman. That's extremely possible for God. It's impossible for us, but it's possible for God, because God is the creator of life. So now this was a breakdown of Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure you go to my website tomorrow and take a look at that blog post that I will have out. And while you're over on the website, make sure you take a look at the shop that I have there and pick up one of your P40 Ministries t-shirts today. That will help support everything that I'm doing here on the podcast, because I am doing all of this stuff voluntarily, and I love that. But if you enjoy what I'm doing, make sure to pick up that t-shirt and help support this podcast. And I really do appreciate you guys, and I thank you guys so much for tuning in every single morning. But I want to ask everybody that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Happy listening, and God bless.